Hola, ¿cómo estás? Espero que estés súper bien. This is Tamara Marie, host of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. Now, before we jump into this episode, I wanted to let you know about a special opportunity that you're definitely going to want to take advantage of, especially if your goal is to become fluent in Spanish. For a limited time only, my team is opening the doors to listeners of the podcast to take advantage of a free language coaching session. Now, in this session, it's not just we're teaching you about verbs or grammar, but we're really going to do a deep dive into what are your goals for learning Spanish, assess where you are on your journey to fluency at the moment, and help you map out a 90-day plan for how you can get to fluency. So we are going to help you take your Spanish to the next level, whether you're afraid of speaking Spanish or you just get a little bit nervous when you're talking to native speakers, or maybe you've got some of the basics down, but you really know that you struggle with getting your Spanish to flow and your listening skills aren't up to par. Whatever it is, even if it is a specific grammar issue, we will help you map out how to tackle that. And normally these sessions do cost, so we are offering a few slots for free. There are limited spaces available and they'll only be open up through the end of the month. So make sure you sign up. Go to SpanishConSalsa.com/coach. That's SpanishConSalsa.com/coach to book your free language coaching session where we will help you map out a 90-day plan to get to Spanish fluency. Okay, let's get started with the episode.
Bienvenidos! Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast, the show for Spanish learners that love music, travel, and culture. Close your grammar textbooks, shut down the language apps, and open your ears to how Spanish is spoken in the real world. Let us show you how to go from beginner to bilingual. Here is your host, certified language coach, Tamara Marie.
Hola y bienvenidos al episodio 126. Welcome to episode 126 of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Olly Richards. Olly is a language educator, author, and polyglot from the UK who speaks 8 languages. He started a blog called I Will Teach You a Language, and since then he's developed the StoryLearning method, which is a new way to learn languages through story. Olly has published over 30 books, consulted for major institutions across Europe, and is a regular speaker at international language events. Now, even though he has such an impressive resume, I have to say Olly is very down to earth. I met him at Langfest back a few years ago now in Montreal. And actually, it was over lunch with him and a couple of other folks that I met there that the idea for Spanish con Salsa was born. And I talk about that on the I Will Teach You a Language podcast, so make sure you check that out. And actually, if you go to the show notes page for this episode, learnspanishconsalsa.com/126, then you'll also see a link to my conversation with Olly if you want to hear more about that story. Make sure you stick around to the end of this episode because there will be a special opportunity for you if you're interested in testing out this method of learning Spanish through story. We'll talk about a few ways that you can do that at the end of the episode, so make sure you stick around all the way until the end. And I hope you enjoy my conversation with Olly Richards. Hola, Olly. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
I am so excited to be here and to talk to you. We've been friends for years, and it's great to be on your podcast finally.
Yeah, it's great to finally have you here. And, you know, I wanted to really get some insight from you on some of the things that you've been doing with your business as well while we sort of chat. But I know you've had a lot of experience with language learning. So for my audience that may not have met you before, may not be familiar with what you do, just give us a little bit of an idea about I Will Teach You a Language and sort of how you got involved in this whole language learning process.
Yeah, so I was a latecomer to language learning. Relative latecomer. So I started learning my first language, which was French, when I was 19, which might sound young to some people, but we all know people that started when they were in the womb, with growing up with 5 languages and all that. I didn't have any of that. But I started learning my first language, French, when I was 19, and I kind of went quite extreme with it. I ended up moving to Paris for a while and did well with French. I've worked really hard at it. That gave me quite a lot of confidence to think, hey, I want to learn some more languages if I want to. So I went on to learn Spanish and Portuguese. And then I traveled a lot, and I went to live in Japan and the Middle East, so I learned Japanese and then Cantonese and Arabic, and then later experimented with a number of different languages. So it's difficult to say how many languages I actually speak now because it's such a moving target. But I've just always been massively into languages. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, I was stuck in Qatar, which is a tiny little Gulf state next to Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. And it's a very dull place to be. There's nothing going on. And so I started a blog about my experience with language learning. And it ended up taking off, not quickly, but gradually over time. And so I kind of kept that up. And then that eventually evolved into I Will Teach You a Language, which is the name of the blog, which is now becoming StoryLearning.com. That happened because I ended up wanting to make useful material for people to learn with that focused on stories. And there's a kind of long history behind why stories, which we could go into if you like. But essentially, I teach languages through stories. And so I write books of short stories and other things like that are specifically aimed at people who are kind of bridging that intermediate gap, because it's quite difficult to find useful material when you are at that intermediate level. There's lots of stuff for beginners, lots of stuff if you're a native speaker or highly fluent, but there's not so much stuff for intermediate learners. So what I basically focus on doing is creating material and courses for people to learn languages through story, and focusing very much on the kind of educational content.
So that's interesting. How did you make that pivot then? Because you said you started with I Will Teach You a Language. And I know a lot of people that are familiar with you in sort of the polyglot space and language learning community know you from your blog, I Will Teach You a Language. So how did you decide to really make that shift to change to story learning when you've already had established that brand of I Will Teach You a Language?
It was a very gradual thing. And it mostly came as I just noticed how much this concept of story learning, as I call it, resonated with people. So, I mean, I've done lots of things over the years. I've created courses on how to improve your memory, and courses on how to, the steps to learn a language and things like that. But it was really once I started writing my books of short stories in different languages that I really started to notice that it really resonated with people. And I would start to get emails from people, and people would come up to me at conferences and say, I really enjoyed your books. They helped me so much. And so I realized that I was onto something. So I then started to think, well, how else can I help? Can I use stories to help people learn? And so I ended up kind of developing whole methodologies around it. So I have my story learning courses are essentially learn a language from scratch, from day one, with stories. So I was experimenting with all of these things, but there came a point where everything I was doing was focused on stories, and even the term story learning started to become so common among my audience that I just thought, well, I will teach you. It shouldn't be about Olly anymore. It should be about what myself and my audience have gone and fallen in love with, which is the idea of learning through stories. And so I spent a lot of money buying StoryLearning.com, and decided to kind of take the leap and actually rebrand the whole thing to story learning. But it was a very kind of gradual process. It seems quite sudden when you lay it out like that, but actually it was something that we were considering for a long time behind the scenes.
No, that makes a lot of sense, that you followed really what was working for your audience. And I think that's something that some people just don't do, right? Like they have an idea and they put it out there and they say, well, this is what I want to show people. And this is sort of what I think makes sense. And without a lot of regard to what is actually working for people. So I think it's good that you picked up on that and took the time to really make a thoughtful decision that if you're becoming known for learning through story, then it makes sense to sort of just say what it is, right? Instead of making it ambiguous, like I will teach you any language, right? So learning through story, much more specific.
It did start off as I will teach you, Olly, this is what Olly thinks, here's what Olly thinks, go and read Olly's. It started off like that. But over time, especially since we've got such a fantastic team of people now who are doing everything from writing stories to editing books to creating courses, I felt more and more that I was being a bit disingenuous by saying every time I would call it I will teach you, because it's just not me a lot of the time. It's so many other people who need to take the credit. So it just felt right on every level.
So talk a little bit about that then. How do you go from, being a language learner to, feeling like, okay, I'm proficient in these languages, I'm fluent, I can speak these different languages, to actually getting to a point where you feel confident that you can help people learn in different ways, and then developing materials like books. I know you've published several books in different languages. How do you really make that shift? Because it's one thing to say, okay, I can speak Spanish or I can speak Portuguese, but it's another thing entirely to write a book for intermediate learners of that language. How did you kind of go through that process and make that transition from learner to teacher?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I've always been a teacher. That's the thing. So I didn't mention this in my little potted bio earlier, but about 12 years or so ago now, I actually changed career and started teaching English. So I took a qualification as an English teacher, and I went to live in Japan to teach English. And so I lived in Japan for years teaching English, and then got quite serious about the teaching side of it. So I went on to do a diploma and then a master's degree in linguistics, and got very kind of highly qualified as a teacher. And so one of the things that I feel has been quite useful for me in developing my career with languages has been the fact that I've had this experience as a language learner, but also as a language teacher, which I think helps me do one thing in particular, which is like beyond learning languages, which is actually to be able to explain concepts. And I feel like I've developed the ability to explain concepts in a way which people can relate to and understand. And that was kind of honed over many years through through writing blog posts and things like that. So actually, when it came to creating courses and things like that, it was actually really the easiest thing in the world, because I already knew the theory. A lot of people who don't have teaching experience, they ask yourself, well, how do you teach a language? The only frame of reference they have is, hey, this is what I did. And I think this is where a lot of people struggle, because that's the only reference they have. It's like, here's what I did. And teaching people what you did is not necessarily the right way to do it. Just because it worked for you doesn't mean that it will work for them. But in my case, because I'd spent so many years teaching, and I was very familiar with lots of different teaching theories, the science of second language acquisition, that I was able to put together methodologies for learning through stories that I was confident with, because I know the literature, I know the research, and I know the practicum as well from having done it for so many years. So, I mean, we could talk specifics if you like about learning with stories, but it was actually one of the easier things for me, because I've had so many years of that teaching experience.
You said something that really stood out to me, was just that, a lot of people teach what they did, and that doesn't always work for people. I think there's a great parallel with that in music as well. So like with dancing salsa, there are some great dancers, right? And you look at them and you watch them in awe, and you're like, oh my God, they're like the best dancers. And then you go to take a class with them and you realize you're not really learning anything, because like you're not able to sort of dance the way that they do, and they're not able to teach it because they feel like they have this sort of like innate ability. And it's really funny that you mentioned that, because there's some really great dance teachers as well that are great teachers, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the person that you're watching like on Dancing with the Stars or whatever like that. So it's just funny that you kind of mentioned that you do have people that are very proficient, but it doesn't mean that they're good at teaching. So that just kind of stood out for me.
Yeah. The teacher does, the teacher doesn't have to be the practitioner. I mean, think of the great sports coaches. Roger Federer's tennis coach would lose to Roger Federer in a game. The same for all different kinds of coaches. Some of these coaches, in fact, never really had careers at all. They just become coaches, and you can develop the ability by working with students for long enough to actually be able to become an effective guide. And so, I think you do get teachers, language teachers, for example, who are not particularly good at language learning, but are great teachers over, through decades of practice. But I personally do feel that, especially with language learning, having the experience of having learned languages really does count, because the thing that's unique about language learning, and everyone listening will immediately appreciate this, is that it's really it's a really nebulous thing. It's very difficult to be specific about progress, you don't feel progress from one day to the next, or even 1 month to the next. The nature of learning a language is more like, you kind of study for a year, and you realize, hey, I'm better than I was a year ago, but I can't tell you when it happened or how it happened. It's such a nebulous thing that I think the language learning, perhaps more than other disciplines, does really benefit from the teacher having the experience, because it's more difficult in language learning, I think, for teachers to really give truths, because there are very few truths with language learning. Effective language learning is far more about issues around motivation, for example, or social anxiety, or self-discipline, or little things like having the time or being able to create the time in your life to actually learn. Like, these are the things which can really torpedo your progress. And I think if you haven't experienced that in yourself, by yourself, it can be very difficult to actually effectively help a student through the learning process.
Right, which is why I think that, there's this bias, I think, when people are looking for language teachers that, I have to have a native speaker. It has to be a native speaker. But I think that what you sort of lose with that, if that native speaker has not had that experience in learning another language, it's really difficult for them not only to teach you, but also to explain the features of their own language. Because I don't know about you, but like with English, if someone was to ask me, is the verb to be an irregular verb? Like, I wouldn't... I don't have all this stuff like at the top of my head, and I haven't really spent a lot of time explaining English grammar. It's just sort of, that's how you say it, right? So when you come across a native speaker, they just go, that sounds wrong. This is how it's supposed to sound. They can't really give you a proper explanation unless they've been properly trained. And the ones I found that are the best are also ones who have also learned other languages so they can help you. But even still with that, I would rather learn from someone who learned that language, because they can point out those things. This is kind of like this in English, or, hey, this is kind of like that in French, if you know French. Like, having that exposure, I think, is really important with languages, because all those connections really help you remember and really grasp things. Whereas just like, that's the way it is not the best explanation that you can get.
I absolutely agree. And let me tell you, through all the teacher training programs that I've been on over the years and also delivered, because I was a teacher trainer for some time as well. Some of the best teachers, certainly some of the best English teachers that I ever came across were non-native speakers, NNS as they're known. And it's for exactly the reason that you say. So the English teaching world is an oddity, because English teachers on the whole, they travel abroad to teach, and then the English teaching world has kind of created this kind of this unspoken rule that, well, in fact, it's not unspoken at all. It's kind of the perceived wisdom that all language classes should be in the target language. So you have English teachers who are from the UK or from the US would travel to Japan, and they would teach Japanese students, and the class would have to be in English. And the kind of the theory, which I think is a bit of a cheap theory, is that, well, the more that you keep the class in the target language, the more they're going to learn. But actually, if you can give a very concise, accurate explanation of a particular grammar point in Japanese to those students, they're going to understand it immediately, and you're going to save yourself 5 minutes of faffing around in trying to convey this abstract concept in English. And the reason, call me cynical, but the reason that I think this kind of meme of always keep it in English has evolved is simply because those teachers don't speak the language of their students. And so they wouldn't be able to explain it in the student's language anyway, because they haven't learned the language. In the reverse situation, it's a bit different, because if you imagine you take lessons with a Spanish teacher, that Spanish teacher most likely speaks English, and that's how they communicate in their lessons. So non-English teachers, or teachers of other languages who are not from a native English background, they generally have at least some experience of learning English at the very minimum. So I think there is a kind of the English teaching world and the foreign language teaching world are quite different. But yeah, some of the most effective teachers I've met have been non-native speakers, because they've been through the process. And that's why people like you and I, Tamara, can I think be very effective at what we do, is because we know what it's like to try and wrap our head around the present perfect in Spanish, and to understand what exactly is the difference between the preterite fui and iba and he ido, habría ido. What is the difference exactly between? We've had a native Spanish speaker can't explain that.
No.
But we can, because we've had to understand it ourselves, so we can explain it in a way that other native English speakers are going to really relate to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things you mentioned is saving time, which to me is a big a plus because, I used to volunteer teaching English for, it wasn't just for native Spanish speakers, but that was what was mainly in the community. And Catholic Charities had this program. So I volunteered there one summer and they were, like you said, only speak English. But I spoke Spanish, so I would kind of cheat like with the Spanish speakers. I'd be struggling to like use pictures and like try to explain something, and then I would just be like, "Verde, okay, it's green, okay, like let's just move on, right?" Like, and then I would just make more progress to the point that the people liked me because they were like, she understands me, and we can connect. And I think making a connection with your students is also really important, and just sort of them realizing that I knew, and not that I would always speak to them in Spanish. I would try to sort of respect the rules of the program, but when I needed to save that time, making that connection and just sort of giving that quick explanation was so much easier than trying to be orthodox about, this sort of strict immersion. So I like the practicality and time saving of that. So, okay, now let's delve into story, because you've talked a lot about story learning, how you sort of came up with this concept. Talk a little bit about why that works so well. Because like for me, as you know, I learned a lot through music. Music and story have a lot of relationships. A lot of songs tell stories, right?
Yeah.
So I know the power that has for just kind of linking into your mind, to getting you to learn things, to memorize things without effort. So talk a little bit about how narrative and story really works for language learning and why you've seen that be successful for your students.
Yeah, so there's two different elements to this. The first element is story itself and what's special about story. And the second element is how that's done in practice and how that actually manifests in the classroom, which is through extensive reading. So I'll start with story and then why it's effective, and then talk about extensive reading. So the basic idea with story is that it's a language that we already have in common. Okay, so if you imagine any story, you can imagine like a fairy tale or a crime story. Every culture has these stories, and we all intuitively understand things like the hero's journey, the story arc. These are things that exist and have existed for thousands and thousands of years. So when you are using story as your starting point, you already have something in common. And so what you're doing in a very simplistic sense is actually just kind of mapping these new words and phrases in the new language onto something you already understand. And so story gives you that as a huge benefit when you're starting. Compare that to how most people start, which is studying grammar textbooks. And when you're studying grammar, and so here's how you conjugate the verb to be, everything is abstract. It has no real meaning. Yo soy, tú eres, él es. These are things to be memorized. They have no inherent meaning to them, right? But with story, everything already has meaning. And whether you understand all of it or not yet, you're dealing with something that is already understood. And so this is a really on a very deep level is a more kind of direct path through to really knowing the language. Story as well has all kinds of fascinating physiological effects on the brain. So for example, if you read a story about something sad, then the part of your brain that experiences sadness will fire up, and you'll be able to track this in brain imaging scans. And so what learning with story does is that it activates all these different parts of the brain. And the way that memory is formed is through connections from different parts of the brain. So by activating the whole brain, you're just embodying the language in every sense, and you're giving yourself really the best possible conditions for learning. Again, compare that to a grammar classroom where everything is logical. It's very left brain logical work, which is going to be, so you're going to be working just in one tiny part of the brain, which just by itself makes stuff more difficult to remember. So from a very kind of conceptual point of view, stories just give you everything that the grammar classroom does not. Now, in practice, if you ask, well, what does learning through stories mean? What do you actually do? Well, the main concept here is that you spend time with the language. So when you're reading stories, you're spending time not studying grammar, not memorizing vocabulary, but just reading stories and listening to stories. And this is known as extensive reading, spending lots of time with the language. Again, if you compare this to the traditional classroom, you're not spending any time with the language. You're just looking at rules and abstractions. But with story learning, you are spending your time reading all day long, and you just do more and more and more. And the more you build up your ability to read, the more you end up reading. And it's like this kind of virtuous circle where over time you develop the ability to actually read anything you want around your interests. And then you're learning like a native speaker does by reading books, by going to school, by just living your life in the language. And that is how you get to a really native level in the language. That's how you can kind of master grammar without having to learn the rules, because stuff just makes sense to you on an intuitive level because you've just seen it so many times in the stories that you've been reading. So what we're trying to do with story learning is, yes, we're using stories, but we're also encouraging this input-based approach to learning, where you're spending your time not studying in the traditional way, not deliberately practicing or forcing output, which means speaking very, very soon if you don't want to, but rather just spending your time listening and reading lots and lots of input, and then you give your brain the opportunity to learn as you go.
I like how you mentioned just sort of that immersive aspect of it, because it's also one of the things that I believe is a parallel with music. One of the reasons why I stuck with Spanish as long as I did was because it was a part of my life, and I was dancing, I was singing along with music. So it became a really immersive experience that I didn't have to force myself to try. It was literally, like songs, like you get these earworms, they pop in your head and you'll be singing the song even when you don't intend to be. So I would often find myself doing that. But I thought about, as you were explaining, learning through story, how we get caught up in like our favorite stories, even like a movie, right? We think movies are about special effects. They're really about, like you said, the hero's journey. They're about the story. We get immersed in the character. And I just thought about, wow, if you had that level of involvement, that level of immersion with another language, right? It then, you're right, it does become so much easier because you're not thinking about like, how is the grammar structured? You're thinking, wait, I want to know what happens. Like, is he going to get the girl? Is he going to get to the end? Is he going to get what he wants? Like, you want to know what's going on with the character, and all that other stuff falls away where you're, preoccupied, I think, maybe too much on, oh, did I say something right? Or is this the right way to say something? And the part you mentioned about extensive learning too, I often find that now with Spanish, I am at a point where I can just tell someone something sounds wrong. Like the thing I mentioned earlier that native speakers do. That's frustrating to learners. But I think it's also helpful because it does speak to the level of exposure you've had. When you see something said, quote unquote, the right way so many times, it is going to come at you as an anomaly when you hear it another way. You're going to go, that's not quite right. Right? Like I can say, ¿Cuál es tu nombre? I know that's right. Why is it not ¿Qué es tu nombre? Who cares? It's not right. You know what I mean? Because I've just heard it so many times. So I think that there is something to be said for just that immersive approach, and then learning, like you said, like a native speaker learns, because that's really how we learn our native language, right? We don't sit down with a list of rules. We listen to people, we say things, we mimic them, and then eventually we get corrected on our anomalies, but we don't sit there and deliberately sort of figure all that out when we're babies, right?
No, exactly. And I think, you don't have to do this through stories. I mean, like you're just describing with music, it's very similar. You can also get this kind of immersion through speaking, through just living with Spanish-speaking people. I mean, the thing that's particularly helpful about stories is that it's something that you could always be doing, right? So you can always be, you don't have to, you can be by yourself at home and you can be reading. Whereas speaking, if you're not lucky enough to have an immersion environment with lots of Spanish speakers, you can't be speaking all that much, right? So the big benefit of reading and with stories in particular is that you can always be doing it any time. You can always have it on your, on the Kindle app on your phone, or you can have a book in your bag or whatever it may be. And music is fantastic for that as well. So much. I learned Brazilian Portuguese through music. I actually sat in my room when I was a student, and I taught myself to play the guitar by looking up bossa nova chord charts on the internet, and then just kind of practicing the chords and learning to sing these songs. And I would memorize word for word these songs in Portuguese, and I wouldn't know what they meant. And I would then go and impress my Brazilian friends by singing like Antonio Carlos Jobim songs word for word, but I wouldn't know what they meant. But of course, eventually, after learning this 10th, 20th, 30th song, I did start to understand what they meant. And then, like you say, things like ¿Cuál es tu nombre? Becomes just totally second nature, and it couldn't be any other way. Even though it just kind of, to your English brain, just doesn't make any sense of which is your name. What are you talking about?
Which out of this list of names is yours?
Yeah.
Right?
It's just the way it is.
Right. Very cool. Yeah. And I love that you had that experience with Portuguese. I actually did try to do some quarantine immersion with samba in Portuguese.
Nice.
When I was at home. So I was taking samba classes. I was speaking Portuguese. And I think, anytime you find a way to immerse yourself in the language is you're winning, right? Because you're not putting forth all this effort. I think we think language learning has to be hard, right? Or we think that you have to have some sort of natural, sort of innate ability. And that's something I do want to ask you about, because you mentioned at the beginning, that, you can't really keep track of the language you speak now. And I know, a lot of my listeners are probably thinking, you've seen these videos of polyglots and people speaking, I speak 47 languages or whatever like that. And they might be really intimidated, and they might be like, I'm just trying to learn Spanish. And they may feel like listening to someone like you just have this natural gift, right, for language. So what would you say to someone who thinks that, there are people who are just gifted at languages, people who are good at language, and then people who are not? What would you say to them?
Yeah, it is a kind of a problem with the polyglot community in particular. I think it's a mixed blessing, right? Because on the one hand, so many people actually start learning because they see people who've learned lots of languages and they think, yeah, that means I can do it too. But then at the same time, you get people who are kind of discouraged and then think, well, what's wrong with me? I mean, this person speaks 20 languages and I can't even learn one. So it's a mix. It's a mixed blessing, but I think it is what it is, and it does reflect the reality that throughout much of the world, multilingualism is the norm. There are places in India where it's totally normal to speak 3 or 4, 5 languages. In Europe as well, it's very common for someone who lives in Luxembourg to speak French, German, Italian, and then the local language. So, what would I say to people who think that? I mean, because I'm aware that also it doesn't really help for me to say, it's the norm in much of the world for people to speak lots of languages, because that as well kind of, you can take that the wrong way as well. I mean, I think this goes for so many things in life, that comparison is such a difficult thing, and this is why I personally really dislike social media. One of the many reasons is just because you're kind of just put in this goldfish bowl where you are just comparing yourself with other people. Look at this person's life. Why is their life more fun than me? Of course, beneath the surface, it's usually not. So, I think really this comes back just good life advice, really, where just get clear on what you want to do, try to shut out the noise, and then work diligently at what you're trying to do with the help of someone who has done it before and can guide you along the path, and just stick at it every day, because that's how we all learn. I've learned many languages, but I've also been doing it for a long time. And whereas other people like playing football or reading novels or watching TV, I like learning languages. I've just spent a lot of time doing it, and I've been lucky enough to live abroad. So it's not that I haven't done this. I didn't wake up knowing these languages. I put the work in over a long time. That's just how I've chosen to spend my time. But for what it's worth, I don't do multilingual stuff a great deal anymore. I tend to focus at the moment. I'm just focusing on one language, which is Cantonese, because my wife is from Hong Kong, and so that's the language that's kind of meaningful for me right now. And I would happily sacrifice a whole bunch of languages to be better at Cantonese, because that's what's meaningful for me. So I think this always has to come down to what's meaningful for you. And I think so much in life is about understanding what you want. Connecting with those desires, and then just really following through and making sure that your actions are doing your desires justice, and that you're not just kind of thinking, I want to learn Spanish, and then 7 p.m. comes and then you're zoning out in front of Netflix. Making sure that our actions are doing ourselves justice is important, but it's one step at a time.
Yeah, and I think one thing you mentioned is that, you put in the work, right? You spent the time. And I think a lot of times, like you mentioned on social media, or you go on YouTube, it looks like, oh, wow, this person just popped up and they're just speaking these languages. You don't know how heavily edited or scripted their videos are. You don't know how proficient they really are.
And you also, often very.
And you also, don't realize that, regardless of what you may see sort of presented, that there is a lot of hard work that goes into it. And fortunately, there are a lot of resources available now that maybe weren't available 10 or 20 years ago that make language more accessible. But just because you see people like that, don't assume that it's not hard work to learn a language. So there's nothing wrong with you. There's no language gene, right? There's just the desire. And I think mindset is really important, and just putting in the work and sticking with it.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of the downside of learning languages is I can't speak English anymore. The proliferation of resources is not, I don't think, is necessarily a kind of universally good thing either, because, you can have all the resources in the world, but you still got to turn up every day and spend that hour learning, So I think what you said is absolutely right. It's the mindset again, making sure that your actions are in line with what you're looking for. That's, that, to the extent that there is a language learning secret, that's it.
Yeah, it's simple but not always easy, right?
Very much so.
Okay, entonces ahora tengo un par de preguntas para ti en español, ¿está bien?
Sí, claro.
Ok, entonces porque este es Learn Spanish con Salsa, ¿cuál es tu canción favorita en español? Si tienes
Dios
una.
Mío, Dios mío, qué pregunta. Es imposible tener una canción favorita. Yo soy músico, de hecho, me formé en la música y tengo tantos años de amor con la música que hay unas cientos canciones que me encantan. Hombre, yo diría que probablemente sería o un bolero mexicano o una salsa de los bandanos, NG la banda a lo mejor. No te podría decir cuál, pero son aquellas canciones de México o de Cuba que realmente me quedan en la cabeza y en la memoria. Y el momento que oyes una salsa de los bandanos, es imposible no moverte, ¿no?
Sí.
Así que, sí, algo así. Pero también me encanta la música argentina, el folclore, el tango, porque pasé un tiempo en Argentina también. Muchísimas cosas, pero sí, algo de Cuba o de México.
Okay. Una pregunta difícil, ¿no?
Muy difícil. Sobre todo para un músico.
Sí. Entonces, una pregunta que puede ser difícil también. ¿Tienes una pregunta o dicho en español que es algo importante para ti? Una palabra favorita en español. Puede ser una palabra o un dicho.
Hay un dicho que me encanta que es el camino se hace al caminar. El camino se hace al caminar, que en inglés sería you create the road by walking, que para mí significa que realmente no hay, si hay algo que quieres hacer en la vida, no hay un camino predeterminado para seguir, sino tú tienes que buscar cómo lograrlo, cómo conseguir lo que quieres. El camino se hace al caminar y eso es, yo vivo mi vida así.
Sí, y tienes que empezar primero, ¿no? No es
sí,
como,
claro,
no hay perfección, no hay perfección.
Como el dicho chinés, ¿no? The journey of a thousand miles begins with a single step, o algo así.
La última pregunta que tengo es, si no tuvieras que trabajar, y yo sé que tú tienes un negocio, ¿no? Pero no necesariamente tienes que trabajar como todos nosotros, pero si no tuvieras que trabajar, ¿qué harías con el tiempo adicional en tu vida?
Si me hubiese preguntado eso hace 20 años, te diría que pasaría todo mi tiempo estudiando los idiomas. Ahora no. Creo que sí, bueno, si no hubiese el virus, el COVID, estaría viajando, porque me encanta viajar, pero también tengo familia, casa y todo, entonces viajar también es muy práctico. No sé, ¿sabes que de todas tus preguntas, esa es la más difícil? Porque es algo que me pregunto muchas veces cuando tengo tiempo libre, ¿qué me gusta hacer? La verdad que ahora lo que más me gusta es hacer cosas lindas, ¿no? Caminar en la playa. Vivo aquí de coche, en coche de 10 minutos a la playa. Voy mucho a la playa para pasear. Me gusta estar en el jardín, salir con mis amigos a tomar algo. Cada vez más me gustan las cosas simples. Y,
sí, la vida simple.
Una vida simple con gente que me guste, con buena comida, con buena música. El problema es que la gente no está siempre libre, ¿no? Así que si estás solo, sí, es un poco más difícil hacerlo. Pero no, una combinación de aquellas cosas. Y bailar salsa también se me olvidó.
Ah, sí. Por supuesto que sí.
Pero tampoco se puede estar bailando salsa todo el tiempo, ¿no?
Sí. Entonces, gracias, Olly. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the podcast.
My pleasure.
And if folks want to get in touch with you and find out more about StoryLearning, where can they find you on social media and all that good stuff?
Yeah, well, if you like podcasts, which I imagine you do, then you could check out my podcast. It's called the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. We also have a Story Learning Spanish podcast, which is a daily Spanish immersion podcast. Or you can find me on YouTube. I make videos about language learning on YouTube. Just search for Olly Richards there, or on my website as well, which is StoryLearning.com. And if you're interested in story learning in general, then you can go to StoryLearning.com/kit, which is StoryLearning.com/kit. And that's a kit I put together that kind of gives you an introduction to story learning. So what's it all about? What rules should you follow? How does the method work? And a bunch of cool free resources there to help you get started in different languages.
Okay. Thank you so much, and que tengas un buen día.
Muchísimas gracias por la invitación y gracias a ti también.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Olly and that you don't feel intimidated anymore now when you see those YouTube videos where people are speaking 27 languages and you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get fluent in just one. I hope he shed some light on that. And also just the power of learning through story. Now, if you're interested in testing out this method for yourself, I did promise you at the beginning of the episode that I would give you some ways that you could do that. And number one, if you go to our show notes page at learnspanishconsalsa.com/126, or you just search for Story Learning Spanish on whatever podcast app that you're listening to this show right now, you'll be able to find the Story Learning Podcast, which is a daily podcast, as Olly mentioned, where you can learn how to apply this concept or this technique to your Spanish. Now, I'll also have a special gift for all of the listeners of the podcast. You can get a 7-day free trial of Olly's course, Spanish Uncovered. Now, Spanish Uncovered is a course for beginners, and it helps you right from the start learning how to learn Spanish through story. So you really go through Olly's method, and actually my son has used this for Japanese, but it's not a course for children. It is for adults, and it does very much take you through how to approach learning Spanish through story in a very methodical way. So there's no guessing of trying to figure out what to do next. But it is a little bit uncomfortable at first. I will say you will be thrown right into a story, but there is a method to the madness. So don't give up right away. Make sure you stick with it, and it will all come together and start to make sense as you go through the course. But in any case, you can try it out free for 7 days if you follow this special link, which is SpanishConSalsa.com/Spanish Uncovered. So again, that is SpanishConSalsa.com/Spanish Uncovered if you want to get 7 days of free access to Olly's Spanish Uncovered course. As always, I hope that something that you heard today has helped you go at least one step closer from Spanish beginner to bilingual. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you for listening to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast at learnspanishconsalsa.com.